Hey, for a long time now, I've found myself in a very interesting position at the height of transgender ideology, and I say ideology not because I believe that transgender identities are something you can negate, but I have a full understanding that 100% of our human population is transgender, because without that understanding, we'd never live in a world with equality. And so, I'm someone, though, who has particularly had a very tomboy, but also femme, but also, just queer upbringing, very masculine rooted in my sense of feelings for other women that I've experienced in my lifetime, but, that's ever changing. Our identities are very fluid. So I think a big mistake with this ideology is it says, oh, I was definitely born a woman, or I was definitely born a man because I feel this way. And so I don't agree with that. I've been wanting to experience my fluidity with my identity for years, and part of the way I've done that is as an artist through comedy, through experiencing full sense of joy in that. And I was trying to get on Saturday Night Live as nonconformist transgender representation that I take seriously. I take it to heart because it is a very serious topic, and I found myself to be a victim of political objectification by Bowen Yang on Saturday Night Live. And how deep the inequities of community go in that sense, where Bowen Yang was Grand Marshal of New York City Pride. Meanwhile, I've been fighting every day for over a year for justice from this true defamation and true harm to my identity that's been lived for my entire life that he knows nothing about. He called me Mark Robinson's search history on national TV. First off, Mark Robinson isn't a person that believes I have a right to choose what's right for my body. Second, that means transgender porn, because that's what his search history entailed. So you're calling me that on national TV because I was born what? Different in womanhood. And so I've tried for over a year now to get justice. I've searched for it. And one of the individuals I thought would care is Sarah McBride, a transgender representation in office in the Democratic Party. And democracy means power to the people. And therefore, I've fought for years trying to bring back that power to the people. And so recently Sarah McBride tweeted, or X'd, now that it's not Twitter, a post about essentially contradictions in the digital age, how, there's two far extremes, and how, if we were actually to get honest in our faith, it could collapse a belief system. So therefore, there are plenty of topics as this victim that I've searched for years, and I've tried to speak into light for years, but maybe I need to be more direct, and I have an issue with, speaking a lot. So here are just some examples of what I've been wanting to discuss, and I hope you offer me, respect and earnesty in this. So the same pluralism that asks people to recognize complexity should also apply to women who question aspects of transgender ideology. So a woman's disagreement with the claim that gender identity should override sex in every context does not make her hateful or incapable of respecting transgender people. And men, whether cisgender or transgender, should not be treated as possessing greater authority than women to define women's experiences, boundaries, bodies, and political interests. Those questions should remain open to disagreement, evidence, and women's own lived testimony. So if most people don't completely agree or completely disagree with one another, then that principle has to apply to women too. Women should be able to question transgender ideology, defend sex-based boundaries, and discuss how policies affect female bodies without being reduced to an anti-trans caricature. Likewise, transgender people can disagree with those arguments without treating every woman who makes them as hateful. Democracy requires allowing both sides to retain complexity rather than demanding ideological conformity. So a woman does not become obligated to surrender her understanding of her own sex because another person has a different theory of gender. Respect can be reciprocal without requiring intellectual submission. If democracy depends on allowing people to disagree without caricaturing one another, that principle has to apply to women too. So the irony of demanding nuance from everyone except women is difficult to ignore. We're told that people are complicated, identities are complicated, disagreement is complicated, until a woman says that sex matters. Then suddenly her entire political position is reduced to hateful. That isn't pluralism, that's ideological sorting. So no individual possesses a specific democratic authority to define another person's political reality for them. A transgender person can explain their experience of gender. A woman can explain her experience of sex. Neither experience should automatically silence the other. The moment one group is granted the power, though, to declare its interpretation of reality beyond legitimate disagreement, you've stopped practicing pluralism and started demanding orthodoxy. So my objection isn't that a particular man is transgender. My objection is to the political premise that women should be required to accept a male person's definition of womanhood as authoritative over their own understanding of sex. Men do not acquire epistemic authority over women's bodies simply because the political vocabulary surrounding gender has changed. So you cannot simultaneously tell me that identity is deeply personal and then claim my understanding of my own sex is politically illegitimate. If your identity deserves recognition because you are the authority of your own experience, then women deserve that same intellectual freedom to describe theirs. Otherwise, lived experience becomes a principle applied selectively. So democracy requires more than tolerating people who already agree with us. It requires preserving the legitimacy of disagreement. That means a woman can believe transgender people deserve dignity while rejecting the proposition that gender identity should supersede biological sex in every circumstance. If that position is automatically classified as hatred, then the problem isn't merely disagreement over transgender policy, the problem is the disappearance of political pluralism itself. So the real question isn't whether transgender people deserve dignity or not. They do. The harder democratic question is whether dignity requires intellectual agreement. It doesn't. A pluralistic society can recognize someone's humanity without requiring everyone to adopt the same ontology of sex and gender. Women should not have to choose between compassion for transgender people and the right to articulate sex-based boundaries, experiences, and political interests. There is a profound democratic contradiction in demanding recognition of a self-defined identity while simultaneously treating people who dispute that definition as intolerant, fascist, or regressive. Democracy means that no individual gets unilateral ownership over the language everyone else must use to describe reality. A person can ask others to recognize their identity, but that request does not automatically become a political command. And when the subject is sex, the stakes are different from ordinary self-expression. Sex is not merely an internal psychological category, it's also a material reality around which women's bodies, reproduction, privacy, vulnerability, discrimination, and political interest have historically been organized. Women should therefore retain the ability to speak about those interests without being told that their disagreement itself constitutes as oppression. I also reject the idea that compassion requires ideological surrender. I can believe that transgender people deserve dignity, they deserve safety, they deserve freedom from discrimination, while still questioning whether self-identification should determine every sex-based category in law and society. That isn't fascism, it is precisely the kind of disagreement a democracy is supposed to protect. The irony that a politics supposedly centered around personal autonomy can become extraordinarily coercive. So the irony is that politics supposedly centered around personal autonomy can become extraordinarily coercive when it demands that everyone else surrender their own conceptual boundaries. Democracy is power to the people, not power to whoever has the strongest claim to define the people. If we genuinely believe in pluralism, then women must remain free to say what sex means to them, what boundaries they need, and what policies they believe protect them, even when those conclusions contradict someone else's identity. The history of the word gender is way more complicated than the modern political argument suggests. It comes with the French gendre, from Latin genus, a word associated with kind, class, lineage, and birth, before developing into its grammatical and later sex-related meanings. 1960s psychology, if you were wondering. So I don't believe it's intellectually serious to pretend that the word has always meant a purely internal, psychological identity detached from sex, nor is it serious to pretend that etymology settles the modern debate. Words evolve. What matters is whether we can debate what they should mean today without declaring dissenters, fascists, bigots, or enemies of democracy. So overall, the main statement is that peace requires pluralism. So I want peace personally from men, not because I believe every man is dangerous, but because women deserve a political space in which our bodies, boundaries, experiences, and interests do not have to be negotiated away in order to make someone else feel comfortable. So that's why I find the contemporary debate around sex and gender so difficult. What troubles me is not the existence of transgender people, hence I identify as transgender, nor the basic proposition that every person deserves dignity and protection from violence. What troubles me is the growing expectation that a contested theory about sex and identity must be treated as unquestionable, and that women who challenge it can be dismissed as hateful, fascist, regressive, or morally defective. Hence a man standing on the stage of NBC SNL and targeting me in a very derogatory, politically objectifying way at the dehumanization of my humanity, for I want peace, for I want protection, for I want liberation in my sexuality and identity in my body, while remaining in my body. So labeling me, Mark Robinson's search history, Eric Adams' indictment, as a man stands on the stage of NBC SNL and takes ownership of the vulnerabilities of what women bodies mean in relation to this world. He was dressed as Charlie XCX, while I fought my entire life for liberation in my sexuality and my identity, to make pop music, to make music that puts my body on the line, because I'm a victim of CSA, so it's really hard for me. So him labeling me immediately as morally defective, that's not pluralism. In Umberto Eco's How to Spot a Fascist, it's very useful here, not because transgender people are fascist, but because Eco gives us a vocabulary for recognizing authoritarian tendencies in political movements. So his warning about the manipulation of language, it's particularly relevant. Language is not merely decoration, it determines what distinctions people are permitted to make, what experiences they can describe, and ultimately what political claims they can articulate. So if changing language becomes a mean of preventing disagreement rather than facilitating understanding, we should be willing to question it. If saying that sex matters becomes evidence that a woman is hateful rather than the beginning of a political argument, something has gone wrong. So if women are expected to surrender words describing their own sex in order to demonstrate moral virtue, that deserves scrutiny. If disagreement itself has become proof that someone is an enemy, democracy has already begun to lose something essential. Democracy means power to the people. That necessarily means no individual or ideological movement gets permanent ownership over reality. So people must remain free to disagree, question, revise, persuade, and even reject one another's premises. Otherwise, we aren't practicing democratic pluralism, we're practicing and demanding ideological conformity. Fuck you, Bowen Yang. Sarah Sherman, fuck you. I also reject the idea that compassion requires intellectual surrender. I can believe transgender people deserve safety, dignity, employment, housing, and freedom from violence while still believing that women have legitimate interest in sex-based language, privacy, boundaries, political representation, and law. Those positions are not mutually exclusive. In fact, insisting that they are creates precisely the binary that democracy should resist. Women should not have to choose between compassion and honesty. We should not have to choose between treating another person with dignity and describing our own biological reality. We should not have to choose between protecting transgender people from cruelty and protecting women from policies we believe may harm them. And we should not have to regard every person who disagrees with us as an enemy. I want peace from men, but ultimately I want peace from politics that demands obedience from anyone. I want a society where a woman can say, this is what I believe about my sex, my body, and my boundaries without being told that her very act of disagreement makes her fascist. I want a society where transgender people can say, this is how I understand myself without being subjected to humiliation or violence. Those statements do not have to cancel each other out. The democratic answer to conflict is not to make one group disappear from the conversation. It is to make room for disagreement without stripping either side of their humanity. Peace does not require women to surrender their voices. Peace requires that nobody has to surrender their humanity. I have been thinking about the word degeneracy differently, not as an insult, but as an old philosophical idea about what happens when something moves away from the qualities that constituted its original kind. The word itself comes from the Latin degenerare, to move away from one's kind, lineage, or inherited nature. Degeneracy historically referred to deterioration, right? A falling away from an inherited condition or quality. That history matters because our modern argument about gender is ultimately an argument about whether sex is something we are, something we experience, or something we are permitted to redefine. I don't use the word degeneracy here as a synonym for moral worthlessness. I use it in the oldest sense, departure. And I think the uncomfortable question is whether a culture obsessed with self-definition can eventually become so detached from the body that freedom itself becomes another consumer product. This is where Fight Club becomes unexpectedly relevant, right? So Chuck P's Fight Club is often remembered as a story about violence and masculinity, but underneath the fighting is an attack on a culture that teaches people to construct themselves through consumption. So the narrator buys furniture, clothes, status, aesthetics, and eventually discovers that none of these purchases can give him the identity he's looking for. The novel is deeply concerned with the possibility that modern capitalism has transformed human identity into something we purchase, assemble, and perform, rather than something we inhabit. That is the contradiction I find worth exploring and exposing in contemporary identity politics. So we're told that liberation means becoming whoever we internally understand ourselves to be, but increasingly that liberation can involve an extraordinary amount of consumption. Hormones, surgeries, cosmetic procedures, clothing, products, legal services, hell, I even buy men's vitamins, legal services, right? Platforms, terminology, legal services, communities, and an entire marketplace constructed around the project of becoming a particular version of oneself. There's something so deeply paradoxical about having to purchase increasingly elaborate technologies in order to experience your life as free. What if freedom does not require buying your way out of your body? What if freedom means learning that your body does not have to be an enemy in the first place? That question should not be interpreted as an argument against transgender people deserving dignity. It is a philosophical question about the culture we're creating, right? So whether liberation is ultimately found through accepting the limits and realities of embodiment, or through acquiring enough social, technological, and commercial power to continually modify itself. And so this is where I think women have a particularly important perspective. So women have historically been told that our bodies are inadequate. We have been sold diets, cosmetics, surgeries, clothing, pornography, beauty standards, fertility technologies, anti-aging products, and endless promises that the body we were born into is a problem. It's just a problem, babes, waiting to be solved. So the answer cannot simply be to replace one form of bodily dissatisfaction with another ideology that teaches people that the body itself is negotiable. There is a difference between medical care and consumer culture's promise that every discomfort can be solved by changing the self. There is a difference between saying you deserve dignity as you are and saying you must become something else to finally be yourself. And perhaps that is why the language of self-creation deserves more scrutiny than it receives. A human being, we're not blank canvases. We inherit bodies. We inherit histories. We inherit relationships. We inherit sex, families, cultures, limitations, responsibilities, and eventually mortality. So none of those facts eliminate freedom. They are the conditions within which freedom exists. To accept that is not oppression. It may actually be the beginning of freedom. So the most disturbing form of consumerism is not when a corporation sells you a couch you don't need. It's when the culture itself teaches you that you are the product, that you must continually optimize, modify, purchase, perform, and reinvent yourself until you are finally being worthy and you finally become worthy of inhabiting your own life. So Fight Club understood that something was wrong with that bargain. It's tragedy that the rebellion against consumerism becomes another form of domination. Tyler Durden, the character, promises liberation and produces another hierarchy. The characters escape one system only to build another. The story itself isn't simply destroy capitalism and become free. It's a warning about what happens when the desire for liberation becomes so absolute that it begins consuming the person who wants to be liberated. That is where I think we should be more careful with contemporary identity politics as well. So society should protect people from cruelty without teaching them that every disagreement with their self-conception is violence. Society should provide medical care without pretending that every biological limitation is an injustice to their humanity. A society should allow people extraordinary freedom to express themselves without requiring everyone else to participate in the same metaphysical interpretation of the human body. And women should be goddamn allowed to say that sex matters without being treated as enemies of freedom. I don't believe freedom means having unlimited authority over reality. I believe freedom means having the goddamn courage to live honestly within reality, including the parts of reality we did not choose. That is a much harder form of liberation than consumerism offers. Because you cannot purchase it. You cannot brand it. You cannot surgically manufacture it. You cannot force another person to believe it. You have to live it. And perhaps the deepest freedom is not the freedom to become whatever the market, the culture, or even our own wounded egos tell us we should have to become. Perhaps it's the freedom to stop treating our existence as a problem that constantly needs to be solved. There's something I find increasingly difficult to reconcile with feminism. Why is transgender identity treated as an extraordinarily sensitive subject while the historical identity of women can apparently be treated as infinitely negotiable? I don't mean that transgender people should not be treated sensitively, right? Of course they should. Every human being deserves dignity, privacy, and freedom from cruelty, but sensitivity cannot become a one-way political principle. If someone's identity is worthy of protection because it is deeply connected to their sense of self, then surely women, right, deserve the same consideration when speaking about the history of our own goddamn sex. It is our own goddamn motherfucking sex, right? So women did not simply invent the category of womanhood as an aesthetic preference, right? We actually inherited it as a material and a political condition. For centuries, being female determined whether you could own property. Now we are property. Whether you could receive an education. Now we can't educate. Enter a profession. Control your money. Now we cost money. Vote. And now suffragette statue is vandalized. Leave a marriage. Access contraception. Receive adequate medical care. Or exercise meaningful political power. So guess what, guys? Whoa, that history matters. And the women who fought against those restrictions did not merely ask society, hey, please recognize my feelings. They demanded recognition of their material existence. Mary Wollstonecraft was making this argument in 1792, and now a man's on day 1792 of womanhood when she wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She challenged the idea that women existed primarily to be attractive, obedient companions to men, and argued that women should be educated as rational human beings capable of independent judgment. That is one of feminism's foundational insights. A woman is not an ornament. She is not a man's possession. She is not a reproductive vessel. She's not a sexual category created for someone else's pleasure. She is a person with a mind, a body, interest, full agency, responsibilities, ambitions, and political agency. So that is precisely why I become uncomfortable when the history of womanhood is treated as though it was merely a vocabulary problem. The women who came before us were not fighting over semantics. They were fighting over reality. They were fighting against husbands who possessed legal authority over them. They were fighting against institutions that considered female intelligence as inferior. They were fighting against sexual violence and economical dependence. They were fighting for education. They were fighting for political representation. They were fighting for the right to speak. And eventually women fought for the right to vote. So when contemporary politics asks women to regard the category that organized generations of this struggle as infinitely redefinable, I think women are pretty much really fucking entitled to ask a very simple question. What happens to our history? Who gets to decide which part of it remain politically meaningful? And why does asking that question sometimes become evidence of hatred? This is where Mary Shelley becomes interested to me. Shelley's Frankenstein is not feminist manifesto in the modern sense, and we should not pretend it is. But the novel is obsessed with questions that remain extraordinarily relevant. Who gets to create? Who gets to define another being? What happens when something is made without considering its relationship to the world into which it has been brought? What happens when a person is denied belonging? Shelley understood that identity, embodiment, creation, and social recognition are complicated, right? The creature's tragedy, it's not simply that he is physically different, it's that everyone around him attempts to decide what he is before allowing him to exist as a complete moral subject. That is why I think we should be careful about reducing either women or transgender people to political abstractions. But there is an equally important lesson. Recognizing one person's humanity cannot require erasing another person's history. So I recognize transgender persons experience their identity profoundly without pretending that women's historical oppression was organized around gender identity rather than sex. I can believe that a transgender person deserves respect without believing that women must surrender every sex-based category. I can oppose the cruelty towards transgender people while defending women's right to discuss their own goddamn bodies, their own goddamn boundaries, their own history, their own political goddamn interests. That's not hatred, bro. That's feminism. And perhaps the greatest irony is that many of the women who established the intellectual foundations of feminism were demanding precisely the thing that modern political discourse sometimes seems uncomfortable allowing women to possess: the authority to think for themselves. Oh my god, Wollstonecraft did not ask women to exchange one approved set of beliefs for another. She demanded that women develop their own reason. That is an inheritance I am unwilling to abandon. If a woman believes that sex matters, she should be able to explain why. If she believes gender identity should determine certain social categories, she should be able to argue for it. If she believes the opposite, she should be able to argue for that too. The democratic solution is not to decide in advance which woman is allowed to speak. It is to let women speak. And if we genuinely believe that identity is personal, then surely we can tolerate the possibility that women will have different understandings of what womanhood means. That is the uncomfortable part of pluralism. It does not mean merely protect people we like. It means protect the person standing across the room from us saying something we profoundly disagree with. I don't want transgender people to be afraid, but I also don't want women to be afraid. I don't want transgender people to have their humanity questioned, but I also don't want women to have their history questioned out of existence. I don't want anyone to be threatened for speaking, but I also don't want politically sensitivity to become a hierarchy in which one person's identity is sacred while another person's identity is treated as disposable. Because if feminism taught us anything, it's that women are not secondary characters in somebody else's stories. We're authors of our own, and the women who came before us fought extraordinarily hard to make sure we goddamn could write it. So you're not gonna fucking take that away from me. I think the least we owe women is the courage to goddamn keep speaking. And the same to transgender people. Keep speaking. But don't overstep my goddamn humanity and erase my history for your need to take ownership of what will never belong to you. One of the most important questions we should be asking about identity in the digital age is not simply, who are you? It is how much of what you understand yourself to be is being reflected back at you. For most of human history, identity developed through relatively intimate and embodied relationships: family, community, work, sexuality, friendship, place culture, and the physical experience of living inside a particular body. Social media has completely changed that environment. Today, a person can construct an image of themselves, publish it to thousands of people, receive immediate feedback, discover communities organized around particular identities, adopt new vocabulary to describe themselves, then encounter that identity reflected back to them repeatedly. The mirror has become social, and mirrors do not merely just show us, mirrors do not merely show us who we are. They can teach us what to look for. This is where contemporary identity politics deserves serious psychological investigation. An identity can become more than a description of experience. It can become the project of the self, something we curate, communicate, defend, perform, refine, and ask other people to recognize. That doesn't mean the identity is necessarily false. It means the identity acquired a new social function. The question becomes particularly important with gender because gender is simultaneously experienced internally, expressed socially, interpreted culturally, and connected to the physical body. When those dimensions become entangled with social media, the distinction between being and being perceived as something can become increasingly difficult to disentangle. A teenager does not simply experience an emotion anymore. They can search the emotion. They can find thousands of people describing it. They can discover an identity category associated with it, which is really dangerous with transgender ideology circulating on Reddit, because you see these people and you say, that's me. that's me, but my identity is entangled to that, right? So we can watch other people essentially explain how that identity supposedly feels. They can adopt the vocabulary, they can announce it publicly, and then an algorithm can continue feeding them content about who they have just said they are. I mean, that's why I exist in this way. That's why I exist. I break the algorithm. I break the chain. I break the frame of what it means to be. Because as a society, we've grown, fed, and locked into this feedback loop, right? So you have your experience, then you have your interpretation, which leads to your identity, which then leads you to find community in that. Then you have recognition, then you have reinforcement, then you have a stronger sense of identity. But that loop's not unique to transgender identity. It can happen with political ideology, religion especially, sexuality, mental health labels, aesthetics, fandoms, conspiracy theories. Those ones are rough. My dad introduced me to the Obama trans thing when I was like 14. Trust me, I know about that stuff. It's those people, it's a feedback loop, right? So virtually any other category out there which human beings understand themselves can exist in this identity loop, right? But gender deserves particular scrutiny because it concerns something unusually fundamental. It's the relationship between the self and the body. So this is where I think we really need to distinguish between identity as being and identity as ego. By ego, I don't mean narcissism or vanity, but I mean the psychological construction of the self, the story we develop about who we are, how we differ from others, and how we want to be recognized. So everyone has an ego, everyone constructs a narrative about themselves. There is a danger in assuming that because a self-concept feels extraordinarily profound, it must be identical to an objective description of reality. So those aren't necessarily the same thing. Like concept of self and an identity of objective description of reality, they're not the same thing, right? So I can feel essentially alienated from my body without that alienation changing the biological facts of my body. So I can feel deeply connected to a particular social category without that category necessarily explaining the entirety of my psychological experience. I can experience something as authentic without authenticity itself functioning as scientific proof. So this distinction really matters because modern culture increasingly treats subjective certainty as epistemic authority, right? Rooted authority. I know who I am, can quietly become, therefore everyone else must understand me in exactly the same way. That is where a personal identity becomes a political demand, and that transition deserves examination. Social media intensifies it because recognition is measurable. Likes become affirmation, followers become community, comments become validation, a profile becomes a public declaration of self, and algorithms reward identities that generate engagement. So the person doesn't simply have an identity, they have an audience for the identity. That changes the psychology. That changes the level of gravity of it. So the self begins to exist partly in anticipation of its reflection. We should be especially careful about this with young people because adolescence has always been a period of experimentation with identity. What is so different now is that experimentation can become public, permanent, searchable, algorithmically enforced, and socially rewarded at an unprecedented scale. So that does not mean young people shouldn't be allowed to explore themselves. It means we should give them enough intellectual space to explore without immediately requiring every exploration to become a permanent ontology. There should be room for it. I don't know. I feel different. I don't feel the expectations placed upon my sex. I don't like them. I don't understand my sexuality yet. I don't feel comfortable in my body. I might be transgender. I might not. I changed my mind. Those sentences, they're not failures. They're evidence of psychological freedom. So a culture genuinely committed to autonomy should not be frightened by uncertainty. And this is where I think social media creates an especially profound philosophical problem. We've constructed an environment in which being seen can feel like proof of being, but recognition is not reality. 1,000 people agreeing with my self-description doesn't make the underlying proposition scientifically true. Likewise, 1,000 people disagreeing with me doesn't make my experience meaningless. Reality is more complicated than the reflection. This is not an argument against transgender people. It's an argument for studying transgender identity with the same intellectual openness we should apply to every other human identity. So if researchers want to understand why people identify as transgender, they should investigate biology, development, psychology, sexuality, trauma, family environment, social relationships, culture, media exposure, peer networks, and online communities, rather than assuming that one explanation must account for everyone. And social media should be a part of that investigation, not because social media necessarily creates transgender identities, but because social media unquestionably changes the environment in which contemporary people discover, name, communicate, and reinforce their identities. That distinction is crucial. Correlation is not causation. Community is not brainwashing. Identity is not necessarily delusional, right? So questioning an identity is not necessarily hatred. We need to be capable of holding all four ideas simultaneously. So perhaps the deepest feminist question is therefore not simply whether someone is allowed to identify as a woman. It is whether women are allowed to maintain an understanding of womanhood that does not depend entirely upon another person's self-conception. And perhaps the deepest psychological question is even more uncomfortable. What if some of what we call identity is the story the ego tells itself after encountering the world? So that doesn't make the story meaningless. Stories matter. They can organize our lives, give us community, provide language for suffering, and help us understand ourselves. But a story, at the end of the day, it's still a story. The body still remains the body, so the world remains the world, and the self exists somewhere in the tension between them. We should not be afraid to investigate that tension, because if identity is genuinely important, it deserves something better than political slogans. It deserves science, it deserves philosophy, it deserves psychology, and above all, it deserves freedom to be questioned. The mirror should help us see ourselves. It should never become the thing that tells us what we are allowed to be. Hello world, this is part 2 of my continuation of not feminism, because I consider myself more of a men, I insist. I think it's stupid that we have to have a label to define the fact that women bodies, female bodies, trans man bodies have their own autonomy and right to establish boundaries that inflect their right to live equally in this world to men without having their humanity and history erased. So part 2, let's dive in. As a feminist, I believe women should be able to speak about sex, bodies, sexuality, privacy, and boundaries without being required to subordinate those realities to someone else's identity. That is the foundation of my discomfort with some forms of contemporary transgender politics. I do not consider transgender people inherently abusive. I do not believe that being transgender makes someone dangerous, predatory, or sexually inappropriate. But I do believe that certain demands made in the name of gender identity can collide with feminist principles of bodily autonomy and sexual boundaries, and I think women should be allowed to say so. For me, the central feminist question is simple. Who gets to decide what happens to my body, and who gets to decide what I must accept about it? Women have spent generations fighting the idea that our bodies exist for other people's purposes. We have fought sexual objectification, coercion, harassment, reproduction control, reproductive control. Reproduction, on the line, chief. In my ass, bitch. Sorry. Marital ownership, and the culture expectation that women should tolerate discomfort in order to preserve someone else's feelings. That history makes bodily boundaries extraordinarily important. If a woman is uncomfortable sharing an intimate space with someone, that discomfort deserves to be taken seriously, even when the other person experiences that boundary as painful or discriminatory. Consent does not mean that everyone is entitled to another person's body, attention, intimacy, language, or physical proximity. And so that compassion does not eliminate boundaries. So this is where I believe feminist politics can become confused. We can recognize another person's humanity without requiring women to override their own physical or psychological boundaries. We can oppose violence against transgender people without declaring every sex-based boundary discriminatory, right? We can treat transgender people with dignity without requiring women to pretend that sex has ceased to matter. We can acknowledge someone's identity without surrendering our own ability to describe our own fucking bodies. For me, that distinction is essential. It is goddamn essential to my humanity. So I also worry about the increasingly sexualization surrounding some conversations about gender. Like when femininity becomes heavily associated with particular sexual characteristics, pornography, submission, or sexual availability, women have every goddamn reason to question whether old forms of objectification are being reproduced under a new language. Like feminism should not require women to become more comfortable with sexualization. It should actually help women become less obligated to accommodate for it. So that is why I resist describing every disagreement about sex and gender as hatred. Sometimes a woman is not expressing hatred at all. Sometimes she is expressing a goddamn boundary. And a boundary is not fucking abuse. But overriding a boundary is goddamn abuse. Because a boundary is one of the mechanisms by which people protect themselves from abuse, right? So overriding that is sexual abuse. It is harm. But at the same time, yes, we do have to be intellectually honest about the word abuse. Actual sexual abuse involves coercion, exploitation, assault, or some other forms of sexual violation. So political disagreement, identity disagreement, awkwardness, or the existence of someone whose body makes another person uncomfortable should not automatically be called sexual abuse. Using the strongest possible language for every disagreement can actually weaken feminist advocacy. If we want women to be believed when genuine sexual abuse occurs, our definitions need to remain precise. So my feminist objection is ultimately not that transgender people exist, it's that no ideology should make a woman feel like their bodily boundaries are morally illegitimate. Like, you can have your fucking boundaries. You deserve a right for your space. So a politics of liberation should enlarge people's freedoms, not redistribute it with bodily entitlement from one group to another. I want trans people to be safe. I want women to be safe. I want children to be goddamn safe. I want men to be safe. I want everyone to have the freedom to live without sexual coercion. And I believe that those goals become more achievable, not less, when we defend a simple feminist principle. Your identity may deserve respect, but my body still goddamn belongs to me. That principle is not fucking hatred. It is the foundation of actually what we call here bodily autonomy. So boundaries fucking set. Back the fuck up, bitch. As a feminist, I believe there is an important difference between asking someone to recognize you and demanding authority over how everyone else is permitted to describe reality. That distinction becomes especially important when pronouns become political rather than merely grammatical. I do not believe that every transgender person who uses she/her pronouns as a natural-born man is narcissistic, abusive, or fascist. People definitely use language to describe themselves for many different reasons, and an individual's identity does not tell us their character. My concern is what happens when a personal request for recognition becomes an enforced claim over another person's speech. There is something fundamentally different between saying, these are the words I prefer people to use for me, and saying, you are morally forbidden from using different language to describe me, and your disagreement demonstrates that you are hateful. The first is a request. The second can become coercion. That distinction matters to feminism because women have historically experienced the consequences of other people controlling language about our bodies. Men have named women, classified women, sexualized women, medicalized women, legislated over women, and frequently told women that their own descriptions of their experiences were incorrect. I therefore find it deeply uncomfortable when any political movement treats control over language as a substitute for persuasion. Words matter. But so does the freedom to disagree about words. If a person believes that she/her pronouns accurately describe them, they are entitled to explain why. Other people are entitled to consider that argument, reject it, or reach a more complicated conclusion. The democratic problem begins when disagreement itself becomes evidence of moral depravity. That is where I think the concept of narcissism can become useful, not as a clinical diagnosis, but as a description of a political tendency. A narcissistic political culture can emerge when personal self-conception becomes so central that other people's independent perspectives are treated as injuries. If you do not describe me as I describe myself, you have harmed me. That principle can become extraordinarily expansive. It can transform disagreements into violence, criticism into abuse, and ordinary linguistic disagreement into a demand for a psychological compliance. But other people possess minds independent of ours. They have their own beliefs, they have their own experiences, they have their own understanding of sex, of gender, of language, and reality. Respecting another person does not require surrendering one's own intellectual independence, and this is where I would connect the argument to authoritarianism rather than simply calling individual fascists. Because fascist is not synonymous with narcissism, disagreement, or transgender identity. Historically, fascism involves authoritarianism, rejection of political pluralism, suppression of opposition, and the concentration of power. So the relevant question is not, is a transgender woman fascist? The relevant question is, does a political culture become authoritarian when it treats dissent as illegitimate and attempts to compel ideological conformity? That question should be asked regardless of which political movement is involved. If a woman says, I understand sex differently, and the response is to threaten her, silence her, socially punish her, or declare her morally illegitimate, I believe feminists should be goddamn concerned. Not because transgender people are inherently authoritarian, but because women's intellectual independence is not negotiable. I want transgender people to be able to live without humiliation. I also want women to be able to speak without coercion. Those principles can coexist. A person's identity can be meaningful without becoming sovereign over everybody else's mind. So a pronoun can be a courtesy without becoming an instrument of political obedience. And recognition can be requested without becoming ownership. That is the line I believe feminism should defend. I will treat you as a human being. I will listen to your experience. I will oppose cruelty towards you. But I will not surrender my independent mind at the price as the price of proving that I respect you. I will not surrender my independent mind. I will not surrender my independent mind as the price of proving that I respect you. Once again, I will not and never will I ever goddamn surrender my independence and my independent mind as the price of proving that I respect you. That isn't hatred. It is called pluralism. And pluralism is precisely what prevents disagreement from becoming domination. So my question to trans women out there, do you want to dominate us or are you us? Because if not, get the fuck out of my way. Stop saying that you're me, because you will never be that. I will never surrender my independent mind as the price of proving that I respect you, because that would be disrespectful as fuck to myself. Sometimes I think feminism needs to ask an uncomfortable question. What do we think women's breasts are actually for? We have managed to turn one of the most ordinary and biologically remarkable parts of the female body into almost everything except what it actually is. Breasts are sexualized, they're commercialized, they're photographed, enlarged, reduced, reconstructed, covered, uncovered, sold, advertised, and treated as symbols of femininity. And yet, underneath all that culture or meaning is a biological organ with a very specific reproductive function. Mammary tissue contains the structures responsible for producing and delivering milk. Lactation exists to nourish an infant, and breast milk provides calories, macronutrients, micronutrients, and immune benefits. That doesn't mean breasts are only for breastfeeding. Human breasts also have sexual and emotional significance, but their reproductive biology is not imaginary. And I think women have a right to be uncomfortable with a culture that increasingly treats the female body as something whose meaning can be detached from its history, its function, and its material reality. This becomes particularly complicated when we look at cosmetic culture. Men have historically been among the consumers of images of women's breasts, while women have simultaneously been taught that possessing the right breast is part of being desirable. The result is a strange cultural loop. Men consume an idealized image of female autonomy, and women are encouraged to modify themselves toward that image. Breast augmentation exists within that complicated landscape, but I don't want to shame women who choose implants. A woman who undergoes reconstruction after breast cancer is not participating in the same thing as a woman purchasing cosmetic augmentation, and a woman who changes her body for her own reasons is not automatically surrendering her autonomy. In fact, breast cancer survivors have made clear how profoundly different reconstruction can be from cosmetic surgery. For some women, reconstruction is about recovering a body that cancer forced them to lose. So that distinction really matters, because feminism should never become another system for telling women what they are allowed to do with their bodies. The question I want to ask is a bit different. Why has the female body become such an extraordinary site of culture intervention? Why are women constantly encouraged to modify the body they were born with? Why is the natural female body simultaneously treated as a sexually valuable and insufficient? Why are women taught that their breasts must be simultaneously natural enough to signify femininity and artificial enough to satisfy an aesthetic ideal? And what happens when that same culture begins treating the body itself as something whose meaning can be completely separated from its biological history? These questions become especially sensitive when we discuss transgender men and women. I don't think it is intellectually responsible to say that every transgender person's medical decision, specifically transgender woman, is caused by pornography, or, essentially too, looking at the other side, male oppression, or, self-hatred. Human beings are much more complicated than that. But I do think that feminism has a legitimate reason to investigate how cultural expectations about femininity and masculinity affect people's relationships with their bodies. We should study whether sexism, sexualization, misogyny, body dissatisfaction, pornography, social media, and gender stereotypes influence some people about decisions with their body. And we should be able to study those possibilities without assuming the conclusion before conducting the research. Because there is a profound feminist contradiction here. Women have spent generations being told, your body is too large, your body is too small, your breasts aren't attractive enough, your breasts are too sexual, your breasts are not sexual enough, your body is aging, your body needs to be fixed, your body needs to be made more desirable. And then we sometimes act surprised when people become profoundly alienated from their bodies. So maybe the feminist answer shouldn't be another demand to conform. Maybe it should be freedom from the demand to make the body prove something. A woman's breasts do not need to justify her femininity. A breast cancer survivor does not need to look normal to be a woman. A woman with small breasts does not need implants to be complete. A woman with large breasts does not owe anyone access to them or their right to choose what's right to do with them. A woman who breastfeeds does not become less sexual. A woman who does not breastfeed does not become less maternal. And a person who experiences complicated feelings about their body deserves the opportunity to explore those feelings without being reduced to a political slogan. That's the kind of feminism that I want, not a feminism that tells women what bodies they must have, a feminism that asks why we have been taught that our bodies must constantly be something else. Because perhaps the most radical thing a woman can say in a culture obsessed with modifying her is, my body does not owe you an explanation, not to men, not to advertisers, not to pornography, not to political movements, not to beauty standards, and not even to feminism. It belongs to the person living inside of it. And that is where bodily autonomy begins. So another note on breasts I ask because I need a proper education. I need a proper understanding of why trans women buy them. What emotion and desire made you buy them, if not the objectification and the dehumanization of women bodies with a capitalistic desire to say that breasts make you me as you shove your cock in men? I think feminists should be cautious about celebrating a culture in which sex characteristics themselves become consumer objects. There is also something philosophically strange about separating a body part from the biological system that produced it. A breast isn't simply a symbol of womanhood. It is an organ with a developmental history, reproductive function, hormonal environment, and relationship to the rest of the body. An implant can reproduce a shape. It cannot reproduce the entire biological history that produced the female body. That distinction does not mean the person who receives an implant is somehow immoral or fraudulent. It means that appearance and biology are not identical concepts. Appearance and biology are not identical concepts. Appearance and biology are not identical concepts, and that distinction should be available for discussion. I also think women should be able to say they don't want their bodies reduced to aesthetic templates. The feminist goal should not be to create a world where every woman has the freedom to purchase whatever appearance she wants. It should be to create a world where women aren't pressured to believe their bodies require modification in order to be equally valuable in this world. That is why my criticism is ultimately directed less at individuals and more at the culture surrounding them. I don't want to shame someone for wanting breasts. I want to question a culture that has taught us to understand breasts primarily through sexual desirability and visual appearance. I don't want to tell people what medical choices they can make. I want women to retain the political freedom to say that biological sex and female embodiment have different meanings that cannot be reduced to aesthetics. And I don't think acknowledging that is cruel. It is possible to say your body is your own, and simultaneously still say a purchased resemblance to a sex characteristic is not necessarily identical to the biological reality that characteristics come from. So those statements can coexist. The feminist challenge is to resist turning either person into an object. Women should not be objects for men's consumption. Transgender people should not be objects for political contempt. And female autonomy should not become merely another product in the marketplace of goddamn identity. The body is more complicated and more valuable than anything we can buy. Porn addiction needs to end today. Where do we need to respect women?
Homemade steak and frites. I've started thinking differently about the relationship between shame and gender. Not because I think shame explains every transgender person's identity. It doesn't. Humans are much more complicated and much too complicated for one's explanation. But because I know what shame can do to a person, when you're taught that certain parts of yourself are unacceptable, you eventually have to decide what those parts mean. Maybe I'm bad. Maybe I'm abnormal. Maybe I'm not feminine enough. Maybe I'm not masculine enough. Maybe I'm supposed to be somebody else. And sometimes the most powerful question shame creates isn't, what am I doing? It's, what does this say about who I am? That distinction matters. A child who is assigned female at birth and grows up being told that being aggressive, being ambitious, loud, physically adventurous, sexually liberated, where emotionally intense is unfeminine, can begin experiencing a conflict between being a female and being feminine. But those things aren't the same. A woman can drive too fast. A woman can be loud. A woman can be ambitious. A woman can love traditionally masculine clothes. A woman can love traditionally like a man. A woman can have a deep voice. A woman can want to provide. A woman can be sexually unconventional. None of these things make her less female, make her less woman, make her less trans man. And I think feminism has an important responsibility to protect that distinction, because historically women have been punished for failing to perform femininity correctly. The tomboy was abnormal. The sexually liberated woman was immoral. The ambitious woman was unfeminine. The assertive woman was difficult. The woman who refused domesticity was selfish. The woman who wanted power was threatening. Feminism challenged those assumptions by saying, you don't have to become stereotypically feminine to deserve to be a woman. That same principle should allow us to ask a parallel question about men. What happens when a boy is deeply ashamed of femininity? What happens when tenderness, beauty, receptivity, vulnerability, sexual passivity, artistic expression, or attraction to men becomes associated with weakness? What happens when masculinity is presented as something that he must constantly prove? And what happens when the internet gives that person thousands of stories explaining those feelings through identity? None of this proves that shame creates transgender identity, but it gives us something worth really studying, because identity is partly the interpretation we place upon our experiences. So a person experiences something, then they ask what it means. Culture supplies possible answers, community supplies vocabulary, and eventually the answer can become part of the self. But that process happens everywhere, not just with gender, but gender is unusually powerful because our society has spent centuries attaching enormous meaning to masculinity and femininity. This is where sexual shame becomes particularly complicated. Sexuality has historically been one of the strongest mechanisms through which societies regulate gender. Women are shamed for being too sexual. Men are shamed for not being masculine enough. Gay men have historically been feminized and stigmatized. Women who reject traditional femininity can be sexualized or degraded. People learn very early that certain desires and behaviors supposedly belong to one sex and not the other. If someone internalizes enough of that shame, they may begin trying to solve the contradiction through understanding of identity. Maybe I'm not supposed to be this kind of man. Maybe I'm not supposed to be this kind of woman. And sometimes the healthiest answer might be, maybe there is nothing wrong with this kind of man or this kind of woman. Maybe there is nothing wrong with being this kind of man or this kind of woman. That's the possibility I don't want feminism to lose, because feminism historically expanded the boundaries of what women were allowed to be. It said a woman could be intellectual, a woman could be powerful, a woman could be sexually autonomous, a woman could be masculine, a woman could reject motherhood, a woman could love women, a woman could refuse men, a woman could build a life that looked nothing like the one society prescribed, and she could remain a woman. That is a radical idea, and perhaps we need the same generosity towards men. A man should be able to be feminine without becoming less of a man. A woman should be able to be masculine without becoming less of a woman. And transgender people should be able to tell us honestly how they experience themselves without presuming that shame, sexuality, biology, or social influence explains every individual case. This scientific question isn't, can shame prove that someone's gender identity is false? It is, how do shame, sexuality, gender expectations, trauma, social reinforcement, personality development, and embodiment interact in the formation of identity? That's a much more concrete and interesting question, and it's one worth studying without fear. Because if shame really does influence someone's personal understanding of themselves, discovering that wouldn't invalidate them as human beings. It would simply teach us that something about how human beings reconstruct and construct meaning from suffering. And maybe the ultimate feminist lesson is, you shouldn't have to become someone else. You should not have to become someone else to escape the shame attached to who you already are. So listen again, you should never have to become someone else to escape the shame attached to who you already are, who you are born as. You deserve the possibility of becoming a woman who is masculine, a man who is feminine, a person who is sexually unconventional, or simply a person who doesn't fit nearly anywhere, without having to interpret your difference and your inability to find community as evidence that your body itself is the mistake. That to me is much deeper. That to me is a much form of deeper liberation, to understand that my body is my body. Who I am is who I am born as, and nothing is wrong with me. I'm not shameful. I'm not wrong. I'm me, and I'm never gonna change. No matter what Bowen Yang and Sarah Sherman do to me on the platform of fucking SNL. Fascist, terrorist, dipshit, losers, fugly.
I think there's a dangerous idea hiding inside contemporary identity politics. The assumption that some people are inherently more vulnerable and therefore more deserving of moral authority because of the identity category they occupy. Transgender people can experience real discrimination, violence, homelessness, family rejection, and social isolation. Those experiences deserve to be taken seriously. But acknowledging vulnerability is not the same as making vulnerability a permanent political status. That distinction truly does matter, because once a society begins treating one category of people as uniquely fragile, something strange happens. Their actions can become much more difficult to criticize. Their beliefs can become harder to question. Their boundaries can become more important than everybody else's. And disagreement can start to be interpreted as harm simply because the person experienced disagreement belongs to a supposedly vulnerable group. That isn't equality, it is a hierarchy of vulnerability. And also, the hierarchy of vulnerability reflects the system which creates it, one built by men, and therefore it's built to serve men, males, trans women. And ironically, I think it can become very dehumanizing. A transgender person is not merely a vulnerable transgender person. They are a whole being, a whole human being, capable of courage, intelligence, generosity, selfishness, cruelty, creativity, mistakes, responsibility, growth, and contradiction. So treating someone as permanently fragile can actually deny them agency. We don't help people by assuming they cannot withstand disagreement. We don't empower people by suggesting they require immunity from criticism. And we don't create equality by deciding beforehand that one person's emotional experience must automatically outweigh another person's. So women understand this problem particularly well. Women have historically been described as fragile in order to restrict our freedom. We were supposedly too delicate for education, politics, physical work, independence, sexual autonomy, and intellectual disagreement. So feminism should be extremely careful about reproducing the same logic in a very different direction. A person does not become politically more valuable because they are considered fragile, nor does a person become less deserving of protection because they belong to a majority category. A woman experiencing sexual violence does not become less deserving of justice because someone else is transgender. A transgender person experiencing violence does not become less deserving of justice because someone else is cisgender. I hate that word. A gay person being attacked does not matter less because heterosexual people also experience violence. Human rights cannot function as competition for who has suffered the most. The answer to vulnerability should be universal principles, not permanent identity-based exemptions. Don't assault people, don't threaten people, don't discriminate against people, don't sexually harass people, don't deny people basic dignity, don't use someone's identity as permission to abuse them. Those principles don't require us to rank whose humanity matters most. There is another danger in turning vulnerability into political authority. It can make ordinary disagreement seem morally sus.
If someone says, hey, I disagree with this person's political argument, and the response is, you're attacking a vulnerable person, the conversation has already changed. The question is no longer whether the argument is true. It becomes diabolical. It becomes whether the speaker is sufficiently compassionate. That's a dangerous shift. Democracy actually requires us to distinguish between harm and disagreement. Sometimes words genuinely are threatening or abusive, but sometimes someone simply disagrees with us. We have to preserve that distinction, because otherwise every political dispute becomes an emotional emergency, and there is something profoundly egalitarian about allowing people to be ordinary. I don't want transgendered people to be permanently placed on a pedestal of fragility. I want them to be allowed to be complicated. I want them to be capable of being wrong. I want them to be criticized when they goddamn deserve criticism. Transpolin was offensive as shit, bro. I want them to be praised when they deserve praise. I want them to have responsibilities as well as rights, but most importantly, I want them to participate in society as equals, because equality doesn't mean saying, you are more vulnerable than me, so I must surrender my voice. It means saying, you are human, I am human, and neither of us get to become less human in order to make the other feel safe. That is the kind of feminism and democracy I believe is worth protecting, is worth speaking out for. That's the end of fascism, folks. I once heard a transgender woman, Sarah McBride, say that transgender men make great feminists. My first reaction was almost instinctive. Perhaps that's because many trans men have lived much of their life as being treated as female, because they were born women, because they were born female. But that thought led me somewhere else more complicated. Feminism shouldn't just be a contest over who possesses the right identity to speak for women. It should be a political movement concerned with women's material conditions, sex-based discrimination, reproductive rights, sexual violence, economic inequality, objectification, and the historical exclusion of women from power. A person doesn't automatically become a feminist because of their identity, and a person doesn't automatically stop being capable of feminist solidarity because of theirs. That means I don't think the useful question is, what have trans women done for women? As though every trans woman has a single political position. The better question is, what does someone actually do for women? Do they defend women's political participation? Do they listen when women describe sex-based experiences? Do they oppose sexual violence? Do they support women's reproductive autonomy? Do they respect women's boundaries? Do they defend women's ability and right to disagree? Those are feminist actions. Identity alone cannot substitute for them. At the same time, trans women can and do participate in feminist movements, advocate against violence, support women organizations, and contribute to feminist scholarship. It would be unfair to erase those contributions simply because they're trans. What I do think deserves criticism is the assumption that women must automatically accept someone's political interpretation of womanhood because that person identifies as a woman. Solidarity is never ownership. A trans woman can advocate for women without becoming the authority on what womanhood means. A trans man can reject womanhood personally while still recognizing the sex-based experiences he inherited and using that perspective to contribute to feminism. And a cisgender woman can disagree with both. That's democracy. Perhaps the most feminist principle is therefore not women must agree about what women are, it is women must remain free to disagree about what women need. Feminism becomes weaker when identity replaces political argument. It becomes stronger when anyone willing to defend women's freedom can contribute, and when nobody receives automatic authority over women simply because of an identity they claim. There's a psychological question I think we should be willing to examine. So what happens when an identity that has become central to someone's sense of self encounters another person's refusal to validate it? For some people, identity is not merely a description. It becomes part of the architecture of self, the story through which they understand their body, relationships, history, and place in the world. That can make disagreement feel extraordinarily threatening. But a woman's boundary is not an attack on another person's existence. A woman saying, my sex has meaning to me and I will not surrender my understanding of womanhood, is exercising the same autonomy feminism has fought to protect for generations. She is not necessarily saying another person should be mistreated. She is saying, you do not own my category. You do not own my category. That distinction is crucial. Feminism was built partly upon women's refusal to allow men, institutions, husbands, churches, governments, or culture authorities to define women's lives for them. Women fought for the right to name their own experiences. Women fought for the right to determine their own political interests. So there is something profoundly feminist about a woman being able to say, I understand myself as a woman because I was born female, and that reality matters to my experience. Someone else may understand womanhood differently. They can explain why. They can ask to be treated respectfully. They can participate in political debate, but they cannot possess another person's inner understanding of herself. And perhaps this is where the conversation becomes psychologically difficult for men to hear. If someone's identity depends heavily on external recognition, Another person's refusal to provide that recognition can feel like a collapse, not necessarily because the other person has actually harmed them, but because the person's internal narrative has collided with an independent reality. That possibility deserves compassion rather than ridicule, but compassion does not mean surrender. Your identity can be meaningful without becoming sovereign over another person's identity. A woman's refusal to redefine herself is not an act of violence. Her refusal to use particular language is not automatically hatred. Her insistence that sex matters is not proof that she wants the person to disappear. Sometimes a woman is simply drawing a boundary around herself, and women, believe it or not, they've spent centuries learning how to be important, learning how important it is for us to be able to proclaim, this is my body, and this is my goddamn experience. This is what I believe full-heartedly, and you do not, and you will never own me. That is not cruelty. That is a feminist liberation. The challenge for everyone is learning to tolerate the existence of another person's boundary. Learning to tolerate the existence of another person's boundary without interpreting it as the destruction of one's own humanity, because nobody should have to surrender another person's autonomy in order to preserve their own sense of self. A woman standing firmly in her own identity is not taking someone else's fucking identity away, because you can't buy me. You can't own me unless you were born in me.
Hello, I finished my steak and frites after a long work day, but I must keep going, and on my job I am on the phone all day. Kinda want Starbies. Artificial intelligence creates an unusual philosophical problem. An AI can learn an extraordinary amount about human beings. It can read literature about grief, study descriptions of motherhood, analyze thousands of accounts of racism, learn the vocabulary of love. It can reproduce sophisticated explanations of experiences that it's never physically lived. Excuse me. AI can know about an experience without necessarily having that experience. That distinction is important, and it really raises an interesting question about gender. What is the difference between understanding a category intellectually and experiencing the material reality that historically produced it? Someone can study women's history without having lived it. Someone can sympathize with women's experiences without sharing every one of them. Someone can participate meaningfully in feminist politics without possessing the same biography of every woman. But there are forms of knowledge that come specifically from embodiment and lived experience. A person born female encounters a body that develops through female puberty. They may experience menstruation, pregnancy, reproductive vulnerability, sexualization, or the social expectations historically attached to being female. Not every woman experiences all of these, but they form part of the material history around the female sex. That knowledge cannot simply be downloaded. This is where the AI analogy becomes useful, not an insult, but as an epistemological thought experiment. An AI can describe motherhood without being a mother. It can explain grief without grieving. It can discuss childhood without having a childhood. Its knowledge can be sophisticated while remaining fundamentally different from embodied human experience. Likewise, knowing the language surrounding womanhood is not necessarily identical to possessing every form of knowledge produced by living as a female person. But the analogy has an important limit. Unlike an AI, transgender people are human beings with bodies, relationships, memories, emotions, and lived experiences of their own. They aren't merely language models assembled from information. Their experiences may overlap with women's experiences in some way, and differ profoundly in others. That's precisely why I think feminism needs a richer concept of knowledge. We should be able to say you can understand something without having lived it, and simultaneously be able to say you can live something without having the authority to define everyone's experience of it. That principle protects everyone. It allows transgender people to describe their experiences without pretending those experiences are identical to every woman's. And it allows women to describe female embodiment without being told that their experience is merely an outdated theory that someone else can redefine for them. The deepest epistemological question isn't therefore who is really a woman, it is what kind of knowledge comes from language and what kinds come from living. AI makes that question impossible to ignore, and perhaps that's the most useful lesson of the analogy. Information can approximate experience, describe experience, even illuminate experience, but information and embodiment are not the same thing at all. Trans women are men, are males, and they will die that way. And trans men are women, are female, and they will die that way. And that shouldn't be a problem, because we are more in common with the opposite gender than we like to framework through binaries that have been established through patriarchal hierarchies that don't give a fuck about my humanity as much as a man telling me what it means to be me. But you're just human AI, bro. We live in a culture of screens. A person no longer has to encounter an unfamiliar feeling privately and slowly develop an understanding of it. Within seconds, they can search it, find thousands of people describing it, discover an identity associated with it, join a community, and receive immediate affirmation. That transformation in how humans construct identity deserves serious attention. I am particularly interested in the possibility that digital environments can influence how some people interpret gender-related feelings. Not because transgender identity is inherently artificial or AI, but because the internet has fundamentally changed the environment in which identity develops. The modern world trains us to want answers immediately. What am I? Why do I feel this way? What's wrong with me? Who am I supposed to be? The algorithm has an answer before we've necessarily had time to sit with the question. That creates a potential feedback loop. Feeling, search, explanation, community, recognition, reinforcement. Again, a correlation like this would not prove that social media creates transgender identities. People may seek transgender communities because they already experience persistent gender dysphoria or identification. The direction of casualty matters, but that doesn't make the digital environment irrelevant. Social media can provide language for experiences that previously had no vocabulary. That can be profoundly helpful. It also encourages people to interpret ordinary uncertainty through increasingly specific identity categories. And that's not unique to gender, right? The same phenomenon can occur with mental health labels, political identities, sexuality, conspiracy, communities, aesthetics, and countless forms of self-understanding. The deeper problem may actually be the loss of uncertainty, because there used to be a period between experiencing something and soaking it in, right? Taking it all in, then deciding what it meant. Now that period can disappear, because I can feel something right now at 10 o'clock. It's 8 o'clock, 8:06. So say something, I feel something, it's 8:06 p.m. Well, let me just go ahead and search it. I've typed in my search, it's now 8:07. Oh, I discovered the right explanation. It's 8:09, it's 8:10, and I search it. Then by the time I'm like, oh shoot, this is something new about myself. Shit, let me post on my Instagram story. Meanwhile, that's only been a 5-minute period, and I already have a newfound identity that everyone is consciously aware of, and consciously then perceiving me as based upon what they've seen, and that energy shapes it. So by the time it's the next morning I wake up, say hundreds of people have reinforced it. That doesn't necessarily make my identity false, but it does mean that identity formation, like the rapidness of it doesn't make the identity false, but it does mean that the identity formation is occurring inside an unprecedented psychological environment, right? Where we don't predict reactions, we don't predict how other people respond to our understanding before we've had the time to feel through it and completely understand what it means in relation to the remainder of the world and history. Because we can be reinforced by communities who may stand for different ideological principles and stand in different positions of power and stand, in different communities. And so we really need to study screens, study algorithms, because there's a lot of, loop patterns, a lot of echo chambers where you're seeing the same thing, you're getting the same patterns. So I stand to really break that because, we understand, everyone understands. I mean, my relative was Alexander Graham Bell. He invented the telephone, what we communicate, and now look at the way Steve Jobs has shifted it. Right? And so we need to study how these screens shape us, because it's not just a cellular device that can reach people, it's also a cellular screen that's built of neodymium, the most powerful magnet in the world. And so, we have the ability to get closer to people than ever because an image is like a layer, and you can add as many layers to something on the internet as possible. It fully breaks down the psyche in a completely new way. It's honestly incredible, right? But there's a lot happening inside of people's psychology as it shifts, as we grow in this sense. So we need to study these screens. We need to study algorithms. We need to study honestly, loneliness. What is the true origin of that? We also need to study access to pornography, different online communities, social reinforcement, adolescent development in this age, body image, sexuality, the desire for immediate certainty alongside gender identity. And that's not because necessarily we already know the answer. It's because we don't, right? So scientific humility is precisely what this subject needs. Scientific humility. So there's also, a broader culture issue here, which is escapism. That's completely understandable. But modern life offers increasingly sophisticated ways to escape discomfort. So we scroll when we're lonely, we consume when we're anxious, we watch when we're bored, and constantly we reinvent our digital selves while our physical lives feel unsatisfying. Sometimes those technologies help us cope. Sometimes they prevent us from confronting the underlying problem. The important question isn't whether every identity is real or fake, it's whether we have created a culture in which every uncomfortable feeling demands an immediate explanation, and every explanation can become an identity. Because perhaps we need to recover the ability to say, I don't know yet. I feel different, and I don't know why. I don't like my body, but I don't know what that means. I'm still figuring myself out, because that's not repressive. It can be freedom.
You have to take the time to work and understand yourself and what your birth means in relation to the rest of this world without running from it, without using my body as a form of escapism. Because sometimes the most radical thing we can truly do is give humans enough time to discover who they are without an algorithm rushing to tell them they were something other than their birth and they are something that, needs change in order to be whole. You are already whole. You are already human. You are already there. What you need to take time to understand yourself and give yourself the freedom to never be complete, but to always be whole. Do you understand me?
One of the contradictions I see within contemporary alphabet soup politics is that a movement created around challenging rigid social categories, and yes, I meant LGBTQIA+ categories, can itself develop rigid hierarchies about whose experiences receive attention, whose boundaries matter, and which conversations are permissible. As a feminist, I think we should be able to examine those inequalities without pretending that every member of an LGBTQIA+ community experiences power in the same way. Gay men, lesbians, bisexual people, well, personally, I believe everyone is bisexual and transgender, 100% of the human population, but anyways, gay men, lesbians, bi people, trans people, I'm going to start saying BT. Anyways, okay, so all the alphabet soup people can have profoundly different political and social interests. Yet, public discourse can sometimes flatten those differences into one unified LGBTQIA+ narrative. That creates a problem when one group's priorities become representative of everyone. I'm particularly concerned when conversations about transgender ideology become politically sensitive that other members of the community feel unable to question them. A movement for liberation should have room for disagreement. If disagreement is automatically treated as betrayal, the community becomes less democratic, not more. That also applies to feminism. Women's boundaries should not disappear because a broader coalition claims to represent them. Lesbians should be able to discuss sexuality. Women should be able to discuss sex-based boundaries. Gay men should be able to discuss their own experiences. Transgender people should be able to discuss theirs. Nobody should have to surrender their particular experience to preserve the appearance of unity, right? I also think LGBTQI culture should be willing to examine its own traditions, rather than assuming every tradition is automatically progressive. Drag can be brilliant art, comedy, political satire, and culture expression, but it isn't synonymous with LGBTQI+ liberation, and it certainly shouldn't be treated as the only legitimate form of queer performance. The relative visibility of drag queens compared with drag kings raises quite an interesting question about gender itself. Why does femininity on a male body receive such enormous culture attention, while masculinity on a female body can remain comparatively invisible? Right? There are many possible explanations: commercialized history, entertainment markets, RuPaul, audience demand, and the particular history of drag culture, so we shouldn't reduce that disparity to one explanation. But feminism should be willing to investigate it. Women have historically had complicated relationships with public performances of femininity because femininity itself has often been imposed upon them. Masculinity can therefore carry a different political meaning when performed by women. That does not mean women are responsible for a lack of drag king events, nor that drag queens are somehow inherently exploitative. It means gendered culture power deserves examination from every single direction. And I don't think political regression is something we should automatically attribute to Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, or progressives. I mean, honestly, every political movement is capable of becoming regressive when it stops examining itself. So if an LGBTQIA movement says it wants liberation but becomes intolerant of internal criticism, it has a contradiction to resolve. If feminism says it believes bodily autonomy but dismisses women boundaries, it has a contradiction to resolve. If conservatives say that they value individual freedom while restricting people's private lives, they have a contradiction to resolve. Because democracy requires all of us to examine our own side. The LGBTQIA community does not need to perfect ideological unity. It needs something healthier, much healthier. The ability to disagree without abandoning one another, and the courage to admit that liberation does not mean every member of a coalition has identical interests. That, to me, is what genuine progress looks like in 2026, and that's not wrong. I think there is a serious democratic question when politicians who identify as transgender advocate for democracy while simultaneously treating disagreement about sex and gender as politically illegitimate. But I would not place responsibility for a woman's electoral success on trans women as a class. Political outcomes are produced by voters, institutions, parties, candidates, media, and many competing interests. The stronger argument is essentially about whether a political movement creates enough room for women to discuss sex and gender openly. Consider the symbolic importance of a woman seeking the presidency, right? So a candidate such as Kamala Harris cannot simply represent an abstract category called woman. Her political history exists within the material history of female citizenship,
women's exclusion from voting, political leadership, reproductive politics, workplace discrimination, sexual violence, and the century-long struggle to be treated as full political subjects. I mean, those realities deserve to be discussable. If progressive politics make the word woman so politically fragile that women cannot explain what the category means to them without being accused of hatred, well, it creates a ginormous strategic problem. Because democracy requires contested ideas to remain discussable, and a democracy, dude, it cannot function if one group's definition of an identity becomes immune from questioning. That doesn't mean trans people should be excluded from political participation. Quite the opposite. Transgender citizens have every democratic right to advocate for their interests. But democratic participation also means accepting that other citizens, including women, may disagree. A woman should be able to say, my understanding of womanhood is rooted in female sex and lived experience. Another person can disagree. The conversation should then continue. That is preferable to creating an environment where the woman becomes afraid to articulate her position because doing so might be interpreted as hostility towards trans people, and there is a broader feminist concern here. So if women cannot openly discuss what it means to be female, feminism loses one of its most fundamental political tools, the ability to name the conditions that affect women as a sex class. You cannot effectively discuss pregnancy, menstruation, reproductive health, sexual violence, sex discrimination, or female vulnerability. You cannot do that if the underlying category of womanhood is treated as politically unstable and unspeakable. We all know what it means to be a woman. We all know what it means to be a female, and we all know that trans women are men. That does not require hostility towards trans people. It requires conceptual clarity. I therefore don't think the answer is blaming trans women for political regression, but it is pretty regressive to be born with a cock and think womanhood is for sale. Anyways, the more productive criticism is directed at any political culture that confuses inclusion with ideological agreement. So if a movement wants to persuade voters, it has to allow voters to actually think. That's the whole fucking point of democracy, you idiots. So if it wants women to participate politically, women must be allowed to describe their own experiences. If it wants democracy, it has to tolerate disagreement. And if it wants genuine progress, it cannot demand that people surrender difficult questions simply because those questions make someone uncomfortable. A democracy isn't strengthened when everyone is forced to use the same definition of womanhood. It is strengthened when women, trans people, and everyone else can argue about that definition openly and still remain equal citizens afterwards. Because let's be real, womanhood is a birthright, not a choice of your ego, and it is never going to be vulnerable to live a lie.
Hey guys, I wanted to talk a bit, about the current canonical issues, right? So there's something very politically significant about men entering a conversation that has traditionally been framed as belonging exclusively to women. I'm very proud of men that are speaking up about the WNBA because it shows they care. And Inez Cantor Freedom, by the way, their name means friendly, prayer worshiper, freedom. So, amen, sir. Fuck, I fucking misgendered her. Shit, I'm gonna get canceled. See, he's done exactly that. Excuse me. Yeah, he has previously argued that the WNBA athletes deserve equal treatment and media respect, and he's now really placed himself directly in this controversy surrounding transgender participation in women's basketball. So whether someone agrees with his methods or not, I think there's a very important principle underneath the controversy. Men are capable of recognizing that women's boundaries matter without speaking over women. And that distinction really matters. A male athlete who says, I believe women's sports should remain organized around female athletes is not necessarily trying to become the authority on womanhood, right? He can instead be making an argument about competitive categories, physical differences, privacy, and the preservation of opportunities that were specifically created for female athletes. So Cantor's current intervention is particularly provocative because he has declared his intention to enter the 2027 WNBA draft, effectively turning the league's rules into a public test of their own principles. The WNBA has responded that there are currently no immediate eligibility issues and has criticized what it describes as bad faith efforts to exploit the controversy. That confrontation raises a much bigger question about identity. Identity matters because people are not abstractions. A female athlete has spent her life developing a particular body, competing within a particular category, and understanding herself through that experience. Her identity as a woman is not merely a word attached to her jersey. It is part of the history through which she arrived there. But identity cannot become a substitute for argument. If someone says that a particular sporting category should be based on sex, the response should be evidence and reasoning, not simply the accusation that the person is intolerant. And this is where I think men who speak about women's sports can potentially contribute something valuable. They can say,
I don't have to be a woman to recognize that women deserve boundaries. I don't have to experience female puberty to understand why female athletes might care about competitive equity. I don't have to inhabit a woman's body to recognize that women are entitled to the spaces created specifically for them. That isn't paternalism if women themselves are being listened to. It can be a form of solidarity. So the irony is that the WNBA controversy is happening at the moment when the league itself says there are no transgender players currently on the roster. The debate is therefore largely about what the category should mean before an actual eligibility dispute arises. That makes the conversation about something bigger than one athlete. It's about whether institutions are allowed to define the purpose of sex-based categories clearly. And I think women deserve a very clear answer. Not because transgender people are uniquely threatening, not because every trans athlete is acting in bad faith. It's because women's sports exist for a fucking reason. A women's league isn't simply a showroom displaying bodies for public consumption or on a stage upon which every political argument about gender has to be performed. It is a goddamn workplace. It is a competitive category. It's a community. And most importantly, it belongs to the athletes who built their lives around it. So I don't think the interesting question is whether Inez Cantor Freedom should be celebrated as some perfect feminist hero. He isn't automatically a feminist because he disagrees with transgender inclusion. The more intellectually honest question is, can a man challenge a policy because he believes its disadvantages women without being accused of hatred for doing so? I believe the answer is simple and has to be yes. Because if women's boundaries can only be defended by women, and only when those women agree with the prevailing political narrative, then we haven't created liberation in the slightest. We've actually created another form of ideological permission. And perhaps the most meaningful male allyship is surprisingly simple. Don't speak for women, listen when women speak, stand beside them when boundaries are challenged, and accept that their bodies are not a form of political property. That is a much more interesting kind of masculinity than domination, trans women. Trans women are dominating. That's a much more interesting kind of masculinity than domination. Don't speak for women, listen when women speak, stand beside them when their boundaries are challenged, and accept that their bodies are not your political property. It is solidarity without ownership.
So a continuation of that, because I feel like the WNBA is still being too retarded to actually listen. So the WNBA should be able to have difficult conversations. I don't think it's that difficult. I think it's quite simple about sex, fairness, privacy, and boundaries without turning every disagreement into a culture war spectacle, right? So what bothers me is the tendency to treat women's sports as though women are obligated to be symbols for somebody else's political argument. They really aren't. Women who built professional women's basketball actually fought for the right to have a sporting environment organized around female athletes. So their bodies are not props for political messaging, and their boundaries shouldn't become entertainment for spectators who have no stake in the consequences. So that doesn't mean every transgender athlete is acting maliciously. It means women's spaces deserve to be discussed as women's spaces. And some of the athletes challenging the status quo are arguably doing something deeply feminist. They're asking whether women should have to surrender their competitive, physical, or social boundaries in order to demonstrate that they are inclusive. That's a legitimate question. The answer shouldn't be decided by whichever side can generate the most outrage online. It should be discussed openly, with the actual women affected given the substantial room to actually speak. You know what? These women should have a right to define their spaces for themselves. I especially reject the idea that women's bodies should be treated as commodities in a political marketplace, like something to be displayed, debated. Why are we being debated? Consumed. I don't want to be consumed by men. We're used to selling ideology built upon their oppression, because women aren't showrooms. Our bodies are not your fucking political merchandise. Our athletic achievements, they're not props. Our boundaries are not hate speech, bro. If the WNBA wants to represent women, then it should be willing to listen to women, not merely use the image of women while treating female athletes as obstacles to someone else's political narrative. Like, the most actual progressive thing a women's league can do is quite simple. Let women be women. Let them compete. Let them disagree. Let women establish boundaries. Let women voices matter, because respecting women as human beings means understanding that female bodies are not for sale, not to advertisers, not to politics, and not to anyone else's fucked up, evil-ass, satanic ideology. So I don't know about y'all, but I full-heartedly believe vulnerability deserves compassion. But I don't believe vulnerability should become a source of political authority. So coming out as transgender can involve genuine fear, rejection, family conflict, discrimination, and emotional difficulty. I don't want to minimize those experiences, but I also don't believe that experiencing vulnerability gives someone else ownership over another person's political boundaries. I mean, as a feminist, this distinction matters deeply to me. Women have historically been told to accommodate other people's emotions at our own expense. We've been expected to be agreeable
hospitable, nurturing, quiet, forgiving, and endlessly concerned with making other people comfortable. Well, I don't want feminism to reproduce that expectation under a new vocabulary. So if a transgender person's identity is emotionally vulnerable, that deserves humane treatment. But a woman's disagreement with that identity does not automatically constitute as an attack, right? A woman should be able to say, this is how I understand my sex. This is what womanhood means to me, because these are my boundaries. This is what I believe feminism should protect. And she should be able to say those things without being told that another person's emotional vulnerability makes her morally responsible for their feelings. There's a very important difference between protecting someone from cruelty and requiring everyone else to validate their worldview. The first is compassion. The second can become coercion. I also think we should be careful with the idea that remaining in one's birth body is somehow inherently a moral obligation. People have complicated relationships with their bodies. Adults deserve autonomy over medical decisions. I cannot know why another individual chooses to transition, and I don't think fear or shame explains every person's experience. What I can defend is my own right to discuss the political consequences of those decisions. My liberation cannot depend upon my silence. If discussing female embodiment, sex-based rights, reproductive vulnerability, or women's boundaries is ever interpreted as a personal attack on somebody else's identity, genuine political dialogue becomes impossible. And so that creates a particularly painful paradox. The more emotionally protected one identity becomes, the less room other people may have to describe their own vulnerability. And that's not equality. A woman's vulnerability matters too. Her fear matters. Her body boundaries matter. Her history matters. Her right to speak without being psychologically punished, Bowen Yang, Sarah Sherman, it matters. So no democratic movement should require, or does require, it's not democracy in that sense, no democratic movement should require one person to disappear emotionally so another person can feel affirmed. No democratic movement should require one person to disappear emotionally so another person can feel affirmed. I want transgender people to be treated with dignity. I also want women to be treated as autonomous political subjects. Those are not mutually exclusive demands. True inclusion means making room for both. Your vulnerability deserves compassion, woman. My boundaries deserve respect. Neither of us should have to surrender our humanity to prove that the other person has theirs. Neither of us should have to surrender our humanity to prove that the other person has theirs. So detransition is one of the most uncomfortable subjects in contemporary gender politics because it introduces a possibility that an identity movement often struggles to accommodate. What happens if someone changes their mind? That question should not be politically threatening. It should actually be very fundamental to any serious discussion of identity, medicine, and autonomy. So a person can make a decision sincerely and later conclude that it was wrong for them. That does not necessarily mean they were lying at the time. Human beings make decisions with incomplete information. And so our understanding of ourselves can change. The difficulty begins when an identity becomes so politically important that reversal itself is interpreted as an existential threat. So a detransitioner can unintentionally challenge the assumption that transition is necessarily the correct explanation for their previous distress. Their experience can raise uncomfortable questions about social pressure, medical decision-making, sexuality, trauma, body image, gender stereotypes, or the possibility that some people interpret distress through an identity framework that ultimately does not fit them. So these questions, and those questions deserve investigation, and detransitioners need to be able to speak about their experiences without being treated as traitors to a political cause. Otherwise, the community creates this paradox, right, where it celebrates authenticity while making it difficult for people to say, I was wrong about myself. And you see, that's not a very healthy relationship at all with identity. So there is also a very important philosophical distinction between sex and gender, where a person can sincerely experience themselves as belonging to a particular gender identity. But that subjective experience does not erase the biological history of the body they were born into. So for a detransitioner, that distinction can become especially significant. They may ultimately realize that some of the things they interpreted as evidence that they were really another gender were actually manifestations of discomfort with gender roles, sexuality, social expectations, or their own body. So that possibility should not be treated as an ideological crime. Feminism has historically challenged precisely the assumption that personality determines sex. So a woman can be masculine, a woman can hate femininity, a woman can reject motherhood, a woman can love women, right? Women can be sexually unconventional, and a woman can reject every single traditional gender role imaginable and still remain female. Likewise, a man can be feminine without needing to understand femininity as evidence that his body is fundamentally wrong. So this is why detransition raises such an important feminist question, and question in general. Like, are we expanding the possibilities of living within one's sex? Or are we increasingly treating escapism and escape from sex-based expectations as the solution to those expectations? So are you choosing to escape your birth because you can't comprehend your extreme emotion and your extreme discomfort for being unique in your body? Because of sexuality and other social expectations and how you get treated in reality because of a sense of otherness. So, neither should transgender, Like, we need to ask this question, right? Because the most serious danger, it's not that people actually change their minds. It's creating a culture in which, changing one's mind becomes psychologically or politically humiliating, right? So if someone transitions, then later detransitions, and maybe they transition again, the appropriate response should not be, then your original experience was fake, nor should it be, you are forbidden from questioning an ideology that explained your experience. The honest answer is much more complicated. So you experienced a feeling that was real. You interpreted it in a particular way based on your perception. You acted on that interpretation, and eventually your understanding changed. That's human. A mature society should be able to tolerate that complexity. So if an ideology cannot accommodate people who leave it, criticize it, or reinterpret their own experience, then the problem is not necessarily that those people have become dishonest. The problem may be that the ideology has become too dependent upon certainty, and any movement built around human identity should be capable of surviving uncertainty. The freedom to transition means very little if it isn't accompanied by the freedom to reconsider. Autonomy includes the right to say both, this is who I am, and I no longer believe this is who I am. So, trans woman, I no longer believe this is who I am. Be brave, don't be pussies. 'Cause you have dicks. One of the things that frustrates me most about contemporary gender politics is how easily conversations about womanhood can become detached from the material conditions that have historically made being female politically consequential, right? So women do not experience womanhood merely as an identity. Across the world, being born female can determine vulnerability to child marriage, sexual violence, reproductive coercion, poverty, lack of education, restrictions on political and economic freedom. So those realities do not disappear because wealthy Western societies have made significant progress towards gender equality. That creates an uncomfortable question. What does it mean to claim womanhood while remaining distant from many of the sex-based conditions that have historically defined women's oppression? I don't think the answer is trans women are inherently dishonest or cowardly. Their individual experiences are far too varied for that conclusion, right? But I do believe feminism has a right to insist that female vulnerability cannot be reduced to an identity label. So a girl forced into marriage at 9 does not experience oppression because she failed to identify correctly. She experiences it because she is a female in a society that has assigned power to males and vulnerability to females. So a woman denied education does not need a new vocabulary to explain her oppression. A woman subjected to reproductive control does not experience discrimination because someone misunderstood her gender identity. Her body is the political terrain upon which that control occurs, right? So that is why I resist any politics that treats womanhood primarily as an emotional or psychological category while neglecting the material reality of sex. At the same time, Western women should not pretend that every woman shares the same experience. There's race, class, nationality, religion, disability, sexuality, economics, and geography, right? Geography, Bowen. Mark Robinson search issue, geography. Those factors profoundly alter how sex-based oppression is experienced. Feminism should be expansive enough to recognize different women's realities without pretending they are interchangeable. My frustration is ultimately about whose vulnerability gets centered. A society can become extremely sophisticated at discussing identity while remaining comparatively uncomfortable discussing the brutal realities faced by millions of girls around the world. Those are children. We should be able to talk about both. We should be able to care about trans people without allowing trans politics to consume every conversation about women. We should be able to defend women without treating transgender people as enemies. And we should be able to say that female embodiment matters without believing that every person who disagrees with us is malicious. For me, feminism requires returning to something concrete. What happens to people because they are female? Who has the power over their bodies? Who controls their reproduction? Who has access to education? Who is protected from violence? Who gets to speak? Who gets to leave? Who gets to say no? Those questions are bigger than any individual identity. And perhaps the most important feminist principle is that women should never have to disappear from conversations about their own material oppression in order to make space for someone else's identity. There should be room for everyone. But women's boundaries, history, and vulnerability cannot become negotiable simply because the conversation has become politically uncomfortable. Amen. I'm tired, but I gotta go. My country needs me. Stay, Delulu, but not as delusional as the men, right? So one of the most important questions in the gender debate is also one of the least comfortable. What happens when someone eventually questions the identity that once gave meaning to their deepest pain? For some people, transition may be experienced as profoundly relieving. For others, the relationship between gender, sexuality, shame, body image, trauma, social expectations, and identity may be much more complicated. That complexity deserves somewhere safe to go. A person can sincerely believe that transition is necessary and later experience doubt. They can discover that some of their distress came from something they had not previously understood. They can realize that they were trying to escape expectations associated with their sex rather than simply discovering a different identity. And if that happens, they should not be forced into another identity narrative to explain it. Perhaps the most dangerous thing we can do is make people believe that changing their mind proves they were never authentic. That can create enormous psychological pressure. For imagine, spending years being told that one particular explanation accounts for your suffering, building a community around it, changing your body, publicly constantly defending it, only to eventually discover that your feelings are way more complicated than you believed. The resulting grief could be quite profound. There might even be regret. There might be anger. There might be shame. There might be a painful confrontation with decisions that cannot be completely reversed. Those emotions deserve somewhere to exist, and this is where I think society has an obligation to protect people who question transition just as seriously as it protects people who pursue it. Nobody should be pressured to remain transgender because leaving would make other people uncomfortable. Nobody should feel pressured to transition because remaining in the birth feels socially unacceptable. And nobody should be taught that their body is an enemy that must be conquered before they can be psychologically whole. We should also be extraordinarily careful about what happens when shame becomes directed towards the body. If someone experiences profound regret or distress after transition, that person may be vulnerable to self-destructive thinking. The answer cannot be further punishment of the body. Their body is not the enemy. Their past decisions do not make them worthless. Their sexuality does not make them shameful. And their uncertainty does not make them a failure. This is particularly important when discussing sexual shame. It is reasonable to investigate whether shame surrounding sexuality, masculinity, femininity, homosexuality, pornography, or the body contributes to gender distress in some individuals. But we should not assume that every transgender person has the same psychological origin story. The goal should be understanding, not assigning guilt. And women deserve protection in that conversation too. So a woman should never have to surrender her boundaries because another person's identity is apparently emotionally vulnerable. So protecting women's boundaries does not require wishing suffering upon transgender women. We can hold both truths, right? So women deserve bodily autonomy. People questioning their gender deserve psychological space. Detransitioners deserve the freedom to speak. Nobody should feel or be driven towards self-hatred because they're struggling to understand their body. Ultimately, the humane position is also the intellectually honest one. We should make it possible for a person to say, I am transgender, I'm questioning, I detransitioned, or say, I don't know what happened to me without being forced into shame by either side. So if we're serious about bodily autonomy, the goal isn't to make people defend a permanent decision. The goal is to help people become capable of living peacefully inside themselves when their understanding changes. And I think it should. It really should change. I'm not for sale. There's this particular kind of violence that does not necessarily leave a bruise. It is the feeling that your own reality has become politically negotiable, that your body can be debated, that your language can be corrected, that your boundaries can become controversial, that your understanding of yourself can be treated as something another person has the authority to redefine. That is the experience I'm trying to describe when I say that I feel something profoundly wrong with what has happened to my relationship in womanhood. I do not mean that every trans person is personally abusive. I mean that a political framework can become coercive even when the individuals participating in it believe that they are pursuing liberation. And the danger begins with rigidity. Womanhood is not one personality. It is not one appearance. It is not one sexuality. It is not one voice. It is not one relationship to femininity. Woman can be masculine or feminine, heterosexual or lesbian, maternal or child-free, sexually adventurous or celibate, quiet or loud, delicate or physically imposing. The extraordinary diversity of woman is precisely what makes it dangerous, to create such a narrow psychological template for what womanhood supposedly feels like. So if femininity becomes the evidence of womanhood, then women who don't conform to femininity become problems to be explained. And I don't want to live in that world. I refuse to live in that world. I refuse, and I do not want my masculinity interpreted as evidence that something is wrong with my sex. I don't want my sexuality interpreted as evidence that I belong somewhere else. I don't want my body treated as a question someone else is entitled to answer. I don't want that. I want the freedom to be contradictory. I want to be feminine sometimes and masculine sometimes. I want to be Charlie X. I am Brat. I am Nat. I am myself, and I am fine in that. And I know who I am. I know my limitations. I know my strengths, but I know that I want to be myself, and I deserve that freedom in my gender, in my birth, in my reality, without being stripped bare. So I want to be sexual without having my sexuality define me. Define if a man could stand on the stage of Saturday fucking Night Live and call me Mark Robinson's search history, something so politically dehumanizing and objectifying, as he's dressed like Charlie XCX when I've always wanted to be a singer. vulnerable and able to move with fluidity that doesn't have fear about how other people are perceiving my outfits in the way that I dress. I want to be emotional without being fragile. I want to be powerful without becoming masculine. I want to exist inside my body without having to justify why I choose to remain there. That to me is the opposite of a cage. And so this is where I really struggle with a political narrative that, makes identity so absolute that disagreement itself becomes threatening. So if someone else's entire sense of self depends upon everyone else affirming the same interpretation, then another person's independence can feel like an attack, right? But another person's boundary is not a fucking assault on your identity. A woman saying, this is how I understand my body, it's not saying you're not allowed to exist. She may simply just be saying you don't get to define and you don't get to take ownership of my definition of myself. There is an enormous difference. I also don't believe vulnerability should become a hierarchy in which one person's emotional pain automatically outranks another person's. Because people can be vulnerable simultaneously. A transgender person can experience genuine fear. A woman can experience genuine fear. A person can be marginalized in one context and possess power in another. A man can experience genuine fear. Human beings are not political categories with permanent vulnerability scores. That is why I want space for complexity. I want transgender people to be able to question themselves. I want detransitioners to be able to speak. You know what? I want women to be able to discuss sex. I want people to be able to disagree about language. I want everyone to be able to say, I don't know, because certainty can become a cage. And perhaps the deepest tragedy of rigid identity politics is that it can take something that should be liberating, the ability to understand yourself in this world, and turn it into another obligation of performance. Like, you have to be this, you have to say this, you have to believe this, you have to validate me, you cannot question me, you cannot describe yourself differently, you cannot leave, you cannot change your mind, you cannot draw a boundary. That isn't diversity, dude. That's conformity wearing the language of liberation. So I don't want to escape into another identity. I want enough freedom to remain complicated inside my own. I contain multitudes. That's not a fucking problem. I don't want to feel trapped either. I don't want to be in a man's cage. I don't want to be living under your perception of what it means to be something you'll never be. Because no human being should have to disappear into an identity in order to become acceptable. Womanhood should be spacious enough for contradiction. Identity should be flexible enough for uncertainty. And political liberation doesn't cost a damn thing. Political liberation needs to leave room for two people to look at the same world, understand themselves differently, and still remain free. So I'm curious to Sarah McBride, are you sorry yet for being so fascist, politically incorrect, and so damn regressive that you believe womanhood is for sale? Are you still dense enough to think your identity is a vulnerability and not a rape on my humanity and our nation? Are you still so hateful, ignorant, and obsessed with being right that you believe I am speaking out to harm instead of protecting you from the inevitable self-hatred when you feel how many children you sexually harmed, how many women you groomed, and how many people you hurt, all while having to feel your dick rub against your thighs as you called yourself a woman, knowing that you had that instrument all this time and still chose to invoke power, privilege, and authority over womanhood autonomy? I'm not up for sale. I'm not up for political ownership. I am a human. I am a human. I'm a human.
Ow, that hurt me, Army. There is something haunting about The Little Mermaid that becomes more complicated when viewed through the politics of voice. Ariel's central conflict is not simply that she wants to become something else. It is that she wants to speak for herself, and Ursula understands precisely how powerful that desire is. She doesn't merely threaten Ariel physically. Ursula offers Ariel a bargain. Surrender your voice, Ariel, and I will give you the transformation you desire, Ariel. That is what makes Ursula such an effective villain. Ursula turns vulnerability into a form of leverage. Ursula takes something that belongs to Ariel and makes Ariel believe that Ariel must surrender it in order to become who Ariel wants to be, Ariel wants to be. The image of Ursula surrounded by captured voices makes the metaphor even darker, and Ursula's character was actually inspired by a drag queen. So voices become possessions. Individual expression becomes something that can be collected, controlled, and stored, and that is why Ursula can be read as a symbol of authoritarian power. So authoritarianism doesn't always begin with physical force. Sometimes it begins with controlling the terms through which people are allowed to speak. Who gets to define you? Who gets to describe your body? Who decides which words are permissible? Who determines whether your disagreement is legitimate? Who gets to tell you that your own understanding of yourself is harmful? Those questions are bigger than transgender politics. They apply to every single ideology out there, but they become more intensely personal when you feel that another political movement has taken ownership of your voice. That is the part of Ariel's story that really resonates with me.
I don't want someone else deciding what my womanhood means. I don't want another person deciding which interpretation of my body I am permitted to express. I don't want my disagreement transformed into evidence that I am hateful, because I'm not. And I don't want my emotional vulnerability dismissed because somebody else's identity is considered more vulnerable than mine. The crucial distinction, however, is that Ursula is a metaphor for coercive power, not a description of an entire group of human beings. A transgender woman is not automatically Ursula, because Ursula was actually defined by a drag queen. So a woman who disagrees with transgender politics is not automatically Ariel. The real danger is the political structure represented by Ursula, this belief that one person or ideology becomes entitled to possess another person's voice. So that is where the metaphor becomes genuinely useful, because Ariel ultimately has to reclaim something that was hers before Ursula ever offered her anything. It was Ariel's voice, and she doesn't become free because someone gives her permission to speak. She becomes free when her voice is no longer someone else's property. That's the kind of freedom I want. I want to be able to speak about my body without being politically owned. So I want to be able to disagree without becoming someone's enemy. I want to be able to define my experiences without requiring everyone else to adopt my definition. And I want other people to have that same freedom, because the opposite of authoritarianism isn't making everyone agree. It is creating enough room and enough space for people to disagree without losing their humanity. So perhaps that's the real lesson of Ariel and Ursula. The villain isn't the person whose identity differs from yours. The villain is the belief that another person's voice belongs to you. So another person's voice does not belong to you. If we genuinely want a free society, there's one principle we cannot surrender. No ideology gets to own your voice. So I hate what these men are doing to our voice, because I want women liberated. I want women protected, and I want women and our entire humanity to live in the peace of protection of the present, of the past, of the now. And so I want fascist individuals to leave us alone. And in a fascist society, there's frequently a misunderstanding that, if I identify as the side of Ariel, then I'm not a fascist, right? I'm a victim of a system built by a fascist structure, because it falls on the structures rather than the individual and the systems which uphold it. And the systems which are upkeeping this is a form of white, capitalistic, misogynistic power that says womanhood is something to be debated rather than something to be born into without a choice. And it doesn't offer us equal room to speak up for how we feel in our humanity in relation to our sex, right? So, it really depends how we move forward. How quickly we're able to move forward. It isn't about how much I say. It's never going to be how much I can say, how much I can express. It's how willing that men are able, how willing that males, men, and trans women are able to get vulnerable. To get vulnerable and understand how politically abusive, regressive, and rigid their understanding of gender roles is in relation to sex. I'm not for sale. I won't let you cross that boundary. You can be yourself and you can be liberated in your body, but I'm not up for debate. My boundaries are my own, and you can't cross them. I won't let you cross those boundaries that my sisters establish. No matter how diverse my sister and how different that sister is from me, that is my sister. That is a female. That is a woman, and they deserve their protection, and they deserve their liberty as much as you. So you don't get my permission, and it's not hateful if I'm not giving you permission to cross a boundary that was established at birth, at gender, at genus. There is a wall here, and you're never going to cross it, and it should have never come to this, because Ursula's have entrapped our spirits and fully fucking raped our liberty. So there's a philosophical connection worth examining between our treatment of nature and our relationship with the human body. I use the word degeneracy here in its older philosophical sense, a movement away from an original or natural condition. I do not mean it as a judgment of the worth of the worth of people who experience gender differently. Nature does not exist according to our categories of convenience. So nature operates through biological processes. The natural, reproduction, inheritance, sexual differentiation, ecological interdependence, growth, and decay. So human beings are very much part of those processes, not separate from them. So that makes the body philosophically significant, right? So our birth does not begin as this abstract idea. It begins as a biological event where we inherit a body, a sex, a genome, a particular relationship to reproduction, and to the natural world. We subsequently construct language, identity, culture, and meaning around that foundation. So the question I find compelling is, what happens when modern culture becomes so dissatisfied with natural limitations that transformation itself becomes the highest expression of freedom? We see a similar impulse in our relationship with the environment. We alter landscapes because nature seems inconvenient. We manufacture substitutes because biological limitations frustrate us. We consume without considering regeneration. We treat the natural world as raw material that exists primarily for our desires. And eventually the consequences return it to us. So this doesn't mean every human intervention in nature is inherently wrong. Civilization itself is an intervention. Medicine, agriculture, architecture, technology have allowed human beings to flourish. The issue is whether freedom means understanding our place within nature or imagining ourselves completely independent of it. So there is such a danger in confusing liberation with limitless self-creation, because if every natural boundary is interpreted as oppression, then eventually the natural world itself becomes something we are expected to overcome. But you see, nature isn't the enemy. Nature is a condition that makes our existence very much possible. That's why I think the language of degeneracy should be approached carefully. Moving away from nature is not automatically morally wrong. Human civilization has always transformed nature. But you see, when this transformation becomes disconnected from ecological reality, embodiment, consequence, and responsibility, it can very much become destructive. So the same principle can inform how we think about sex and gender without turning transgender people into symbols of environmental destruction. A person can question gender roles without denying biology. A woman can reject femininity without rejecting her female body. A man can reject masculinity without rejecting his male body. So perhaps genuine liberation is not the elimination of every natural limitation, right? Perhaps it is learning how to live freely within reality, rather than requiring reality to conform completely to us, because nature doesn't demand that we be identical. Nature, it contains extraordinary diversity, right? But that diversity exists within nature, not outside of it. We don't define nature. Nature is a birth. Nature is that state of being in this place without escape that we don't have choice over. So when you take away the naturalist part of birth, the naturalist part of this earth, which is your birth, what are you doing to the rest of the planet? Because that's the deeper lesson here. When we don't protect nature by pretending that its boundaries don't exist. We don't protect history that way. We don't comfort it. We don't do good for our environment by neglecting nature. We harm it. Those boundaries exist, and those boundaries exist for a reason. So we need to protect nature by understanding them, by respecting them, and learning how to flourish within them, within our bodies, within our births. And so perhaps, that same humility that we treat nature as a magical sense of being where it contains such diversity that's not contained by an ego. So what we need to do is we need to bring that same humility that we have for nature for ourselves before our degeneracy literally ends the planet. That's what I'm saying, and that's the truth, okay? When people say that transgender politics is losing ground, I think there is a deeper question underneath the political rhetoric. So what happens when an identity movement encounters sustained disagreement about its underlying assumptions? So a movement can experience disagreement without that disagreement meaning that its members are being persecuted. Sometimes it means that the public is reconsidering the movement's claims. I mean, we all know about Galileo and studying the planets, right? We all thought that was true for so long. But it ended up being wrong, because we have to reconsider things to grow, to progress, to move forward. We have to get a better understanding of what is healthy. So I would argue that the healthiest response is not a form of hostility, but deep examination. The unexamined life is not worth living. So if someone genuinely believes that their gender identity exists independently of their birth sex, that belief should be able to withstand questions about biology, language, philosophy, medicine, and law. Likewise, someone who believes that sex is foundational to womanhood should be able to defend that position without being treated as inherently hateful. So this is where the word transgender itself becomes philosophically interesting. Trans comes from Latin trans, meaning across, beyond, or on the other side of. It can therefore evoke the idea of moving beyond an inherited category, but that etymology does not establish what gender is, nor does it prove that someone is literally above their birth sex. It describes a conceptual relationship to a category, not a biological fact, and perhaps that distinction is exactly where the political conflict lives. So if transgender identity is understood as a form of liberation, then that liberation should mean the freedom to exist without coercion, right? Not the power to compel everyone else to adopt one philosophical interpretation of sex. So a person should be free to live according to their identity. A woman should be free to understand her sex as fundamental to her identity. Both freedoms require something uncomfortable, the ability to coexist with disagreement.
So I don't think hostility should automatically be attributed to one side. People who feel that their identity is being questioned can experience genuine fear, just as people who feel their sex-based boundaries are being erased can experience genuine fear. Fear can produce defensiveness on both sides, so that is why I don't think the answer is to decide which group is really vulnerable. The answer is to create enough democratic space for people to say what they believe without intimidation. So if transgender politics is genuinely about liberation, then it should not require fear, or it should not require the fear of disagreement. So if feminism is genuinely about liberation, it should not require women to surrender their understanding of their bodies, of their own bodies, because freedom cannot mean that one person's conception of identity becomes another person's obligation. Men are not my obligation, they're not my problem, they're not my responsibility. So the most mature form of gender liberty is not demanding that everyone agree about what gender means. It is allowing people to live, speak, question, and disagree without being stripped of their basic political freedom. That is a much harder form of liberation, but it is also such a much more democratic one. So stop being fascist pigs. When people say that trans rights are under attack, I think we need to distinguish between the right to exist as a person and demands for particular legal, medical, or institutional arrangements. So a person has a right to exist without violence, harassment, or discrimination. That principle should not depend on whether anyone agrees with their understanding of gender. But no political movement is entitled to have every policy associated with its ideology treated as an unquestionable human right. Questions surrounding medical transition, surgery, hormones, eligibility criteria, sports, prisons, schools, language, and sex-based spaces are legitimate subjects of democratic debates. Saying that a particular medical intervention should be restricted, regulated, studied more carefully, or unavailable to a particular population is not automatically equivalent to saying that transgender people should disappear. It's not. Policy disagreement is not persecution, and that distinction matters because democratic societies are supposed to be able to reconsider institutions. When there's evidence, there's circumstances, there's public understanding that's changing, we're evolving, we're getting a greater understanding that our society essentially, if you really break apart, skip whatever I was going to say. So if you really want to break apart our society and understand transgender humans, you have to understand that our society is way more queer than we could ever imagine, right? So as someone who genuinely identifies as transgender, but I firmly believe 100% of the human population is transgender and bisexual because we cannot control another human's liberty in this world, I have a very refined palate, a very accepting personality. I am so accepting of anybody else in this world, and I believe everyone should strive to be this accepting and inclusive with their communities. So essentially, if we're studying transgenderism, if we're studying queerness, you have to understand the universe is way more queer than we could ever have imagined, because for so long, we've had societies that are very much having to adhere to very specific, rigid gender roles and gender structures. Let's say women have to be this, as men are taught they can rule the entire nature of the world. So when you have trans women taking ownership and overstepping boundaries of my humanity, what does direct harm onto my humanity? Because I've had to work extra hard as a woman who identifies as trans, a trans man, a female. I've had to do extra work to overcome this. It's a form of nirvana, a constant spiritual ascension, where essentially I break apart my reality so I can understand the world around me. Because when you're openly out, it's very queer and open. It's like, think of people like Bowie, David Bowie, Freddie Mercury, and that's rare for women. That's rare to see on the women's side of things. Brandy Carlisle is doing an excellent job. And so for me, I thought my place was going to be comedy. I thought, as a comedian, I'm going to have a place to fully express myself and entertain the world and relieve the world. And what that got me was identity-based hatred, because I'm different, because I'm diverse. And so that's a man restricting my identity in transness on a national stage of Saturday Night Live with intent to harm. He knows this was about me. This was targeted by name, written and spoken word, where a man stood on the stage dressed as Charlie XCX, and he called me Mark Robinson search history right before the election season. Meanwhile, I'm a Democrat. I wanted Kamala Harris to be first woman president, but I knew she wouldn't. Because, I thought she could, but it's like when we can't define gender, because men are so obsessed with taking ownership of our stories in a way that's unrooted in reality, that does real harm on society, and it reflects institutions, and it reflects systems that are built to serve the male ego, that are built to serve capitalistic needs, that are built to serve imperialistic structures of taking ownership of something that was never yours to take ownership of. And that's not persecution. It's a policy disagreement dependent on my respect of my humanity in my body and my liberation, because nobody is speaking up in solidarity with me in my reality. I stand alone, and I see people every day strive. I see women suffer. I see women say the truth and get sexually harassed, kicked around, and harmed. And that's not freedom. That's not liberation. That is identity-based discrimination. That is transphobic. So if you trans women want to get a good understanding of transgenderism, well, women are the best people to speak to.
Women are the best people to talk to about transgenderism because we have lived an entire history where we weren't viewed as people, and now you are not viewing me as a person. You're not viewing me as independent to make my best decisions about myself. And so when we study queerness in this world, we also have to understand the systems which it encases, where a man can transphobically target me on the platform of NBC SNL, and I can try to out his abuse for well over a year, and he is to serve as Grand Marshal of New York City Pride because Pride is built to affirm gay male egos. Trans women are usually gay men that get addicted to pornography and they find escapism in my body, and I'm not scared to say that because I don't believe that that's persecution to them. I believe that's relieving them. It's giving them a space to safely express their sexual shame, which led them down this path, which has invoked true harm on my humanity. So when we look at the world, we want to understand it's way more queer than we think it is, right? So I think transgender people are unique in the sense where, in my personal identity, I suffer because being openly queer, being masculine, being empowered in this sense, it frequently puts me in situations where people view my identity in a sense of fear, where they fear me as a human. And when they believe that my humanity doesn't respect their body, when I speak for their safety, when I speak for their protection. And so all this to say is we have to be careful how we treat other people, what we're willing to process about ourselves. How deeply can we look in the mirror of ourselves to see ourselves in our body, in our humanity, without crossing boundaries that were never yours to cross? So everyone is transgender, everyone is bisexual, but your gender is a genus, is a birth. It's a reality that's inarguable. So policy disagreement is not a form of persecution, it's a distinction that matters, because democratic societies are supposed to be able to reconsider institutions when there's evidence, circumstances, or public understanding that changes. So, when we're looking at this, neither side should automatically be immune from criticism. I think returning to reality needs to be defined carefully because biology is real, but human beings have created complex social meetings around biological categories. The serious argument isn't that one side possesses reality while everyone else is delusional. It is about which facts should govern which decisions. So a surgeon needs biological information, a doctor needs sex-specific medical information when relevant. A legislator has to consider competing rights and material consequences. An individual deserves autonomy over their private life. Those principles can coexist. If a movement loses public support for particular policies, that isn't necessarily evidence that its members are being persecuted. So what it may simply mean is that democracy is functioning, that people are allowed to reconsider the rules. And if the movement is genuinely committed to freedom, it should be able to survive that reconsideration. The most dangerous political mistake would be treating every retreat from a movement's preferred policies as an existential attack on the people associated with it. Sometimes a society is not attacking people. Sometimes it's simply saying, we're going to debate this again, and that's not fascism. What that is, that's the epitome of democracy. So we're going to debate this until I have my boundaries redefined and men stop sexually harassing women. We are all transgender. We are all bisexual. That's that.
So I hope this changed the world because I matter. You matter. We all matter. And guess what we have to do? We have to liberate. We have to educate. I'm not for sale. I'm not a sexual object. I'm a human in this human world, and I deserve fair treatment, and I deserve to be liberated from the male gaze, from the male patriarch. I deserve freedom from the white capitalistic structures which encase this world. I deserve to call Alicia Haley what she is. Badass, female, woman, trans man. Because if you want to be a punk rocker, you have to move with the movement, bro. You can't let the movement contagion you, bro. Bro, if you want to be a punk rocker out there, you gotta know what's up. Hers. Yeah. How many women are discovering their voice for the first time in their life? How many women are discovering they have the power to be? They have the power to speak. They have the power to do. Well, imagine how liberated men have always been to do this to our society. Sarah McBride, please, Sarah, please let me be safe. Oh, Sarah, I'm just a poor little girl. I'm a poor little trans man. Please, Sarah McBride, please let Kamala Harris be first woman president. Please stop sexually humiliating us. Oh, Sarah, I need peace. I need the world to work again. Amen. Thank you all for being here. Seriously, thank you all for attending my. Thank you. I hope I ended the debate. Did I end the debate? Can we return to reality? How many people are having a brain aneurysm? Dave, what? Bros, leave women alone. Get help. Guys, please. Guys, please. So, that's that. I am just trying to create equality here, bros. If you have a problem with that, I'm sorry you hate women. I'm sorry you hate bisexual transgenders. God, abusers. Fuck. Anybody got any thoughts?